Hello and welcome to Peace Shift, a podcast in which we explore what is needed to live in a more peaceful world. With the people I interview, experts and practitioners from the field, we look at cultural change as well as hands-on activism, and we'll discuss the interconnection of war, conflict and environmental destruction. I am your host, Nina Kouvouts, a trainer, peace educator and author. In this episode, I am interviewing Karen Ridd. Karen is a mediator, facilitator, teacher and public speaker who began working as a practitioner in the field of conflict resolution in 1986. In the 1980s, Karen worked as a human rights volunteer in war zones in Central America with Peace Brigades International, and she received 3 awards for her work there. Karen has worked extensively with communities in international settings and also in First Nations territories in Canada, where she lives. She is a member of the Walls to Bridge collective, teaching university courses inside prisons and jails, a member of the Geisher Bridge Gesture, if I pronounce it correctly, a dialogue and action on Israel and Palestine, and Piecing It Together, connecting social activists with conflict resolution practitioners and resources. So Karen, I'm really excited that you are joining the podcast. I've been telling many workshop participants of mine about how you were going to El Salvador, I think, in the 80s. And it's a great story of solidarity, in my opinion, where you help free a colleague of you. So it's very nice that I learned that you still continue to be engaged in nonviolence and even teach it. So I'm really excited to interview you.
And I'm excited and honored to be here today. So thank you very much, Nina.
Yeah, great. So at the moment you are teaching at the university in Winnipeg, correct?
That's right. And maybe if it's okay, I'll just begin with a land acknowledgement. For us as settlers here on colonized land in Canada, it's important to just acknowledge that I'm joining you from Winnipeg, which is a city in the center of Canada. And it's built on what was traditionally and is traditionally Indigenous land. So the land of the Innu, Ojibwe, Oji-Cree, Anishinaabe, and Dakota people. And the electricity that I'm using comes from northern Manitoba, from the lands of the Dene people in Treaty 5. And the water I drink here comes from Treaty 3, which is the people of the Cree and the Ojibwe people of Treaty 3. So I live on land that was colonized. My ancestors came from Europe and settled on land that was stolen from Indigenous people, and I'm the inheritor of that responsibility of having this colonial privilege. So part of what I do is to try to work to undo the existence of this kind of privilege and to be conscious of the fact that I'm on land that wasn't and isn't really my land, right? So thanks for letting me begin with that. That's important from my perspective. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more how you weave that also into your teachings. Absolutely. So I teach at the University of Winnipeg. I teach at a place called Menno Simons College, which is a college of the Canadian Mennonite University. And I get to teach amazing students because I get to teach the students that want to take conflict resolution and nonviolent social change and restorative justice. And so they're all students that want to make their lives and the world a better place. So very inspiring people to be around. Currently, one of the courses I'm teaching is called Voluntary Simplicity. So it's how do we get more out of the lives that we live while walking gently on the planet. And so every week before class, we do a land acknowledgement. And to this point, I've been the one that's done the land acknowledgements each time. And I try to make them different every time because I don't want them to become formulaic. And I try to connect them also to work that we do. So how are we working to try to restore the wrongs that were done historically and that have had ongoing consequences? So one of the programs that I'm involved with that I think is part of that is a group called Walls to Bridges. Walls to Bridges teaches university courses inside prisons and jails to a mix of what are called inside students, so people who are currently incarcerated, and outside students, other folks. And as you may be aware, in Canada, the carceral rate for Indigenous people is far higher than it should be, much higher than any other demographic. As part of the colonial legacy, we over-incarcerate Indigenous people. And so many of the students in the Walls to Bridges program are Indigenous students who are able to access university for the first time while incarcerated. And the chance to teach those students and to teach them alongside the outside students is it's a transformative experience for the outside students. It's a lot of fun. It's a real honor as a teacher to be able to be part of that. So that's just one example of sort of how I try to live out my desire to work to undo the wrongs of colonization.
Yeah, great. And how is there a perspective also for the incarcerated people to apply these teachings?
Oh, yeah. I think one of the things that's been really fun is seeing the types of insights that the inside students bring to the material. For example, we taught a course in restorative justice. Restorative justice is the idea that the mainstream justice system in Canada, the European justice system, is very punitive, very retributive, and that historically Indigenous people had justice systems. It's just that they looked very different and the colonizers didn't recognize them. And so restorative justice is a movement to try to find other ways to respond when harm happens. So to have people in the class who have been judged by the retributive system and who are thinking about the ways in which that system doesn't operate well, doesn't work well, either for the victim or the offender, is really powerful. And I think it's also one of the ways that we see so clearly that people who are incarcerated are often themselves have often been the victims of wrongdoing earlier in their lives, right? There's a reason that people end up incarcerated. It's most of us don't choose to be there, right? Something has happened in our lives, and usually it's a result of things that have happened earlier in their lives. So lots of wisdom from the people inside in these courses, and that's exciting too.
And is the setting of the classroom, is it some kind of room inside the jail, or how?
Yeah, because we can't get the people who are incarcerated out, so that means that the people who are outside go in. And that's a very eye-opening experience for people on the outside who haven't many of them ever been inside a carceral institution to come into a prison or jail.
So this is what you mean by alongside, because I wondered first if maybe you are teaching two different groups, but you actually put the students together.
We're all together. Yeah, all together in one room, and literally in one room because we can't leave because they can't go back to their cell block without accompaniment, and we can't leave without accompaniment. So we're all in there, and very, very powerful, very moving. And I think it really also brings home how inhumane our carceral institutions are, because the outside students will see things like at the end of our course. So we've been together for 10 weeks, 4 hours, once a week for 10 weeks, and people have become very close in that period of time. And on the last day, the inside students had a conversation amongst themselves about whether or not they would hug us at the end. And the question for them was, if they hugged us, then they would have to be strip searched. And they would have to be cavity searched because of the possibility that in the hug, we might have passed them contraband. So they knew that to hug us meant that they were going to have to put up with that kind of a degrading experience. And they decided to hug us. And what an incredible honor that is to realize the kind of consequences for someone of a simple hug inside a carceral institution. Of course, hugging is such an important thing, right? It's one of the very powerful ways we can connect. So that would be an example of the outside students watching this and thinking, oh my God, they're having to make this kind of decision, and yet they're doing it.
Yeah. I can imagine that it's already such a rich experience, even, in the context, just without taking the content into account.
Exactly. It almost wouldn't matter what you taught in there, right? But bringing people together to think and to interact. And I think I was also really moved by one of the inside women talking about how one of the hard things for her about being incarcerated is she can't parent her kids who were on the outside, and one of them was struggling with school, and she felt that she was now able to set him such a good example by being a university student. And so even though she couldn't be with him and parent him, she was able to be a support to him through the work that she was doing through Ulster Bridges, the schoolwork that she was doing. And that was pretty exciting too, to be able to be part of that. She was also a survivor of the Canadian residential school system. So she's one of the sort of last folks that would have gone through that system. That's still of a sort of a university kind of age. I shouldn't say it that way. It sounds like older people can't go to university, but they don't go to university quite as often. Let me put it that way.
Yes, right. So because yes, I'm less knowledgeable about the situation in Canada as it's like so far away from me. So until when did the residential schools operate?
Well, they operated late into the 20th century, and people often are not aware of that. We think that they happened a long time ago in history, but they were still operating into the 1970s and I think even 1980s at one place in Canada. So, yeah, so we still have people lots of people that are survivors of that system. And of course, many people that are intergenerational survivors. Their parents or their grandparents went through that system.
Yes.
So lots of damage done by that system to people, to a culture. It was an act of genocide, right, by the Canadian government.
And is also trauma a topic that you discussed there?
Yeah. So absolutely, trauma is one of the repercussions, one of the consequences of colonization is that in so many ways, Indigenous people in Canada were traumatized by colonization, by the loss of languages, by the residential school system, by the imposition of educational and justice systems and religious implications, not being allowed to practice spiritual beliefs. The whole assumption by the Canadian government that people that looked like me, right, the white settler folk, were somehow superior or better or did things in better ways. And all of that is enormously traumatizing and has led to all sorts of social issues as a direct consequence of that. And so part of the work too at university is helping students connect with that and also connect with the fact that there's ways that we can respond to that. And one of the things I love about the place I teach is I teach in a very diverse setting. This year, the majority of my students are people of color, either new Canadians or people who are Indigenous folks. People have been on this land since time immemorial. And so to bring together all of us to be thinking about some of these issues is a real privilege. I think one of the other things, connecting back to nonviolence, Nina, that's really exciting is that there's been so much nonviolent resistance in Canada. And often when we talk about residential schools, we do talk about trauma, and we need to, but we sometimes overlook the fact that there was also enormous resistance. And when we do that, we lose track of people's agency and power. But there was all sorts of resistance from kids that would run away, families that would hide their kids, families that would go off into the bush. There was resistance. Families would go and camp outside the schools so that the kids would see them. There was resistance in the schools where the kids surreptitiously spoke their languages or surreptitiously helped each other. So there was all sorts of resistance. And then there was lots of legal resistance where people went to the justice system to try to get their kids back. And we lose track of that sometimes. But that's laid a foundation for a long history of very powerful Indigenous acts of nonviolence here in Canada. Land protectors, water protectors, on all sorts of different environmental issues and territorial issues. So we're very lucky in Canada to have this very powerful history of nonviolence.
Would you say those stories are less documented?
Absolutely. I think, as you, I'm sure would be aware, it's not necessarily in the government's interests to be upholding stories of successful resistance against government authorities through nonviolent action, right? Those are not stories that powerful entities want told because they disrupt their power. And so absolutely what you hear, I think, largely, certainly in Canada, and I expect outside when you hear about things like residential school, you hear narratives about the suffering and the trauma, and those are very true, and we need to tell those stories, but we also need to tell the stories of people's incredible resistance and courage and refusal to cooperate and all those stories as well, because they're also true. And if we don't tell those stories, then we descend into looking at people as sort of an apathetic, passive victim. And that was certainly not the case. People were very, very active in their resistance to the residential schools, for example.
Yeah. This is why I asked the question, because I was thinking perhaps that's also part of what students could do to kind of recover those stories and document them.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that for years my students were able to be part of was the Global Nonviolent Action Database. Not sure if you're familiar with it, but Swarthmore College has this wonderful database of stories from around the world. Great. Yeah, you do know about it. Of course you. So because my students were involved in that, it's actually a really great repository of Canadian nonviolent actions, because many of the students were documenting Canadian cases. Not all of them. They were allowed to document from anywhere in the world, but many of them did document Canadian cases. So there's lots of cases in there that I'm delighted to see in there, because I think it is important to find these stories and document these stories and not lose these stories. If we don't tell, stories are how we pass on our knowledge orally, right? And if we don't tell these stories, then they disappear, and that's so important to keep them alive.
So maybe to go back a little bit, can you
Sure.
share why is it that you chose to teach about all these subjects?
Oh, well,
Or how you got involved?
yeah, there's so many ways to start that story. One place to start that story is with a teacher that I had when I was 17, who was, quote, colored man, unquote, from South Africa by the South African apartheid system of coding people. And he had left South Africa because he refused to teach his black students that they were lesser than white students. He refused to teach the South African curriculum. And this was in the days of apartheid. And he was an extremely influential teacher for me. It was the first time that I felt like there was a connection between what we were doing in the classroom and the world outside. And so that was very powerful for me in starting to think about what's the type of person I want to be in the world. And through one of his courses, I ran into a report by Amnesty International, and it was a report on the dirty war in Argentina, which and it documented some of the torture techniques that were used by the Argentinian dictatorship. And I remember reading that, age 17, the first descriptions I'd ever read of torture, and looking out the window of the library and reading this document, and just watching all the cars go by and watching people go on their daily life, and thinking, like, how can we just allow this to go on? If we all just stopped and said, no, we're not going to do anything until that injustice ends, the injustice would end. But we don't. We go on in our daily lives, and many of us don't know about what's happening. And I remember in that moment thinking that I wanted to be one of the people that worked to try to stop things, not just allow things to go on. So that was a decision at about 17 to try to make that one of the central foci of my life. And it has been. My life feels better when I'm living it in line with my values as best I can. And like everyone else, I screw up in lots of ways. Like everyone else, I'm inconsistent. Like everyone else, I have times when I don't do things or do things I shouldn't do, or all those things. But when I am trying to live my life as well as I can in accordance with my beliefs, that feels right to me. And that's really important. So that belief then led me to getting interested in the various civil wars that were happening in Central America in the late 20th century. I ended up, there was one of the things that Winnipeg was a hotbed for was a lot of Chilean refugees ended up coming to Winnipeg after the coup that brought Augusto Pinochet into power in Chile. And these Chilean activists, they were brilliant. They ran a coffee house every Friday night that was great food, great music, and in between the music acts, they would have what were called charlas, or little talks. And so there would be these little political talks. And so I got a political education at a coffee house. That was great. I'd go back every week for the coffee and stay for the politicization. And out of that ended up, really wanting to get to Latin America. I'm one of these people that doesn't do very well at talking about things if I don't feel really like I know what I'm talking about. And I felt like I had this, I was a basketball player, and I had this coach who was very politically different than me. And he was one of the people that could just say things without actually knowing anything about them. And I couldn't navigate that. And so I decided, if I went to Central America, if I was there on the ground, then I could come back and say, no, I saw this. And that would make me more able to stand up against his kind of style of argumentation. So I ended up going to Central America. And I went to Nicaragua with a group called Witness for Peace, which used the idea of first world privilege, took people from the United States and Canada, put us into war zones as a way to decrease the attacks by the U.S. backed Contra. So, creating a kind of a peace team presence in those regions. And so I was part of one of those groups. I was really scared. I was afraid that I was going to die on this trip. Absolutely. Very, first time I think I'd ever intentionally walked into a situation where I knew I might die. So that was tough. And the other thing that was tough was I actually wasn't committed to nonviolence, Nina, at that time. I had been a supporter of the Sandinista military revolutionary movement. And I really, at that time, if you talked to me, I would have said, nonviolence is kind of naive. Worked for Gandhi because the British were so nice. You can see that my background is British. I didn't believe in it. I thought it wasn't effective. But I wanted to go and get on the ground in Nicaragua. So I went for a 2-week trip. This Witness for Peace was committed to nonviolence so that I could handle it for 2 weeks, even though I don't believe in it. And I started to see how effective it was. And then I went back and worked with peace brigades in Guatemala and had more examples of how effective it was. And finally ended up in El Salvador. And sorry, this is a very long answer to your question. Is that okay? Do you want me just to keep going, or should I pause for another question?
It's an interesting answer. So.
Okay, good. If I get boring, cut me off. In El Salvador, there was a group called the Committee of Mothers of the Disappeared of El Salvador, Comadres. And as you're aware, one of the political practices in many parts of the world, and certainly in the Americas at that time, was to capture people and disappear them, a political action to undercut movements. And of course, it's devastating because it takes people away, but also because it leaves people left behind in this kind of horrific limbo where you are hoping for the person to be alive because you love your loved one, you want them back, but to hope that they're alive means to hope they're being kept in some clandestine jail and maybe facing daily torture, and you can't hope for that, right? So it's psychologically extraordinarily damaging for the people left behind, as well as, of course, devastating for those taken away. And the Committee of Mothers were women who were looking for their loved ones. And when the women would tell the story, they would talk about how, first of all, they would look at their friends' places, or they would look at the hospitals and the police stations, and they'd take a deep breath and they'd look at the harder places, the morgues and the body dumps. And one of the women said to me, most of us didn't find our loved ones, but what we did find was we found each other. And we realized that if we were searching together, we would be more powerful. And then they realized that they didn't want to just search for their loved ones. They wanted to actually stop the practice of disappearing, right? And of course, when they did that, then they became the target of the disappearances themselves. So they had peace brigades presence in their office to make it safer for them. And one of my colleagues was in the office. We would spend the nights there because the women didn't want to go home at night. They didn't want to take that danger back to their families, right? So they would often stay overnight in the office and bring their kids into the office, and peace brigades would be present in the office. And on this particular evening, I wasn't in that office. I was about 2 blocks away at the National Unity of Salvadoran Workers, also spending the night as an accompanier. And we heard a bomb. We heard an explosion. And what had happened was that the military had put a bomb outside the door of the Comadres office, had blown off the front of the building, and were in the street ready to go in to capture people, capture the records, all those sorts of things. And my colleague inside the Comadres office woke up with the bomb, came running down, looked, saw the police in the street, or the military in the street, saw the broken front of the building, was trying to figure out, what do we do? And she watched as some of the oldest of these women went into the kitchen and started making coffee. And my friend thought, like, they've lost it, right? This is the final straw. This has pushed them off the edge. They've lost their minds here. Why are they making coffee when we're all going to get arrested and detained and maybe tortured and disappeared? And she watched as the women filled these cups with coffee and these massive trays, and then went out into the street. And the oldest of the women, with these big trays of coffee cups, out into the street and started giving them to the soldiers. Well, it's 4 a.m. It's cold in El Salvador. A lot of the soldiers don't want to be there in the first place. They're forcibly recruited. They see their grandmother show up in front of them with a cup of coffee. Of course, they're going to take the cup of coffee. And they drank the coffee, and something happened in that exchange of hospitality. And the men drank the coffee, put the cups back, and disappeared into the night. And the women took the coffee, empty cups, back into the kitchen, washed them up, and started to build the front of the building. Well, for me, that was the last straw. That was how could I say that nonviolence is only for the naive when these women, who are the least naive of the people I can imagine, who've gone through the most difficult times, who are the most traumatized and resilient, have made a choice for nonviolence, not out of some foolishness, but of a choice around what's effective and what's right for them in this moment, and that it was effective. And so I started to be fascinated by, again, the fact we don't tell these stories, right? We tell the stories of military history. That's what we teach people, but we don't tell the stories of nonviolent creative resistance. And there are so many, and I think they're really interesting stories. They're engaging and they're inspiring, and I think they speak to the best of who we are as humans. And they're certainly the best of who I want to be as a human. And so I began to study and research and try to support nonviolent action wherever I could. And that's a very long answer to your question of how did I get into this? But that's how I got into it.
Thank you.
40 years ago.
So I have a question that's connected though to your story though. If you put more focus on personal change or interpersonal change or collective change, because you have been speaking a little bit about these different forms of power, you could say, right? And organizing together. Is there a focus that you put somewhere, or maybe you try to cover everything?
Yeah, I think it's both, Nina. Like I think I can't do good collective change unless I'm also working on individual personal change. And yet, to just work on individual personal change in a world where there is so much injustice, and where I have significant privilege as a white-skinned, settler, colonial, university-educated person, if I'm just looking at individual change, that's a deep injustice that I'm doing by not being engaged in the world. So it's one of the things I love about the course that I teach on voluntary simplicity, which is, again, the idea that we try to live our lives in a way that is less consumptive and get more out of the lives that we lead. And one of the foundational principles of that approach is the idea that if I have less stuff, and if I'm less focused on earning money to get stuff, I also have more time. And then I can use that time to be involved in creating a world in which there's more justice for all, more equity, etc. So for me, it's very much a both and together. I'll say one of the things that I'm currently working on that's I think is pretty fun is there's a group of, so one of the things you may know is that an issue in Canada is the various oil and gas pipelines often put across Indigenous lands. And of course, that brings, first of all, problems for climate change because we continue to extract oil and gas. That's problematic. Secondly, these are going across often unceded territories, and the potential environmental repercussions are on the Indigenous people whose land these pipelines are crossing. And so there's many places in Canada where Indigenous people are trying to stop those pipelines from crossing their land for these sort of variety of reasons. And they call themselves water protectors, land defenders. And one of the things that they have asked for, especially the people of Wet'suwet'en, have been asking for non-Indigenous people to be supportive in this struggle and to stand up. Particularly, they've asked us to focus on the banks that finance these pipelines. And one of the banks that's the fifth largest pipeline funder in the world is the Royal Bank of Canada. So a group of Winnipeg clergy and retired clergy, so these are Protestant ministers and lay people who are in leadership in the church, have decided that they're going to risk being arrested and go into royal banks every Wednesday through Lent and hold prayer services calling on the Royal Bank to change their ways and to stop funding pipeline development. But before they did that, they wanted some training. So we did a number of role plays and had them practice their different, who's going to be the person that talks to the police and who's the bank liaison. And it's been so inspiring to watch these people who have spent their whole lives being very cooperative with systems, some of them, now being willing to take this big risk, go way out of their comfort zone, risk being arrested, and do so because of their concerns for their children and their grandchildren and because they're wanting to respond to the Indigenous call for action. So they had their first one last week. They have their next one tomorrow. I'm excitedly following it and supporting their actions, and thrilled that these retired folks who have spent very sort of mainstream type lives are now being willing to take these types of pretty risky actions for them.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what made them shift, right?
Yeah, and I think for many of them would say it's their concern for their children and their grandchildren. That's sort of driving to this, and then an acknowledgement that they have a lot of privilege, and if they aren't willing to take these risks, who better than them to take these risks, given the privilege that they have?
So, could you say a little bit more about the concepts of interdependence and interbeing? Personally, I think this is really important for creating a peaceful world. So, how would you see that?
Yeah. Again, one of the gifts of living where I live is that I have access to a chance to learn from Indigenous elders. And one of the things that elders often talk about is this, that we're all one. And so people will talk about, all my relations is a pretty standard line that will be used in a prayer, an Indigenous prayer in this part of Canada, for Ojibwe and Cree people. So all my relations, and the idea is that we are all one, and all my relations refers not just to all the other people in the room, but also the rocks and the plants and the air and the animals and the fish, and that's all part of who we are. And so certainly, Nina, one of the things that helps me be better in this world and be the kind of person I want to be is I have a daily mindfulness practice, and as part of that practice, I intentionally work on trying to break myself free from the Western European idea of myself as an individual and enter into the experience and my deep belief that we're all one, that we're all interconnected, that when you suffer, I suffer, and that your liberation is my liberation. And I think this isolated Western European idea of the individual self has been so destructive to our world. How could we do the kind of horrific things to the environment that we're doing if we actually saw ourselves as one with the environment, right? We couldn't. We would see that as part of ourselves and part of our own being, but we don't do that generally as Europeans, and I don't generally. I've not grown up in that either. So for me, it's kind of it's an intentional practice that I feel like I'm not very good at, but take baby steps at all the time.
Great, yeah. Maybe we should all try this more. And so maybe let's get into a little bit more a topic of environmental destruction. You already talked about the voluntary simplicity. How do you think that, and also now with interdependence, how is it related in your view, the environmental destruction that we see and our culture of violence, you could say?
Yeah. Well, I guess a couple of thoughts on that, and I'm not sure if I'm quite answering your question, but you can pull me back to it if I'm not. The first thing I just want to name is that we need to talk more about eco-grief and eco-anxiety. We need to talk more about the fact that so many of us, and particularly younger people, are carrying this burden of feeling like the world is collapsing around them and not knowing how to deal with that. And one way to deal with that eco grief and anxiety is to pretend it doesn't exist, right? To keep on our hamster wheels and go faster and faster to try to avoid that pain and that grief. And of course, that's not going to get us out of this problem. What's going to get us out of it is to acknowledge the grief and anxiety. And we know that one of the things that actually helps us deal with grief and anxiety is to do something. So children do better with grief and anxiety if they know that the adults in their lives are doing things to try to make change, to try to right the wrongs that we've perpetrated on this earth. So that's just one thing I think we need to talk more about. We need to talk more about the fact that we live with this miasma and that it gets in the way of our doing things, and that the best thing we can do around it is talk about it and then make sure that we're doing specific, concrete actions to try to make a difference around climate change. So that's one part of what I was thinking when you were talking. Another thing that I have been thinking about is there's a beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass by a woman named Robin Wall Kimmerer. Not sure if you've come across that, Nina, but she's an Indigenous scientist and environmentalist and author in upstate New York area. And in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, one of the things she talks about is how we have to be in love with the natural world. And if we're not in love with it, we won't know to protect it and to care for it. And that we've lost that interrelationship with the natural world. And in losing that interrelationship, then we don't have the feelings that would allow us to care for that world. And so I think that's also really important. And again, one of the things I try to work with students, so we work around, images of what are places that we love and why do we love those places and what is it that those places ask us to do, and if those places had voices, what would they be saying to us? And so trying to help us reconnect with that love, because I think that's, of course, one of the antidotes to violence, right, is love. And I know that sounds smarmy, and I don't mean it in kind of a cheesy way. I legitimately think if we are able to connect with our own love and with the love that we feel for others and the love that is in this world, how could we do violence in it, right? The more we're connected to love, the less we're capable of violence, I think. And in this current way that we're living in the world, many of us were disconnected from our own love, from our love for each other, and certainly from our loving connection to the natural world.
Yeah, so I think also maybe there is, while you were talking, I was thinking there is another part that we need to kind of unlearn doing violence, let's say, and we need some tools to change the thing that they are, right? Because if we just, or I imagine, if everyone can reconnect to their feelings of love for the world and themselves and everything around, then there may just be what you also said, like a lot of grief, right, for how things are at the moment. And then I think people experience a sense of being lost, perhaps, because what then, right? What now? What can I do?
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you're touching on for me, Nina, is how important community is for us. Because it's the community of other people around us that enables us to walk forward with this combination of grief and love, right? That I'm not in this alone. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about this conversation. Where you and I are on different sides of the world, and yet I will go forward for the rest of my day thinking, Nina's a long way away, but I know Nina's over there doing her part, trying to work on this stuff, and Nina knows I'm over here doing this, and so that sense that we are not, this is all far too big for any one person, right? And if I have to carry that feeling of being in this alone, I can't do anything. Mm. I have to know and be reminded and be connected to people that are doing this as well, that are working to try to do the best that we can to halt the damage of global climate change, to work for a nonviolent world, to et cetera, et cetera.
And is there something that you are doing? Probably many things, but besides what you have already mentioned, at least, in a community context?
Yeah. So there's a couple of other things that I'm pretty excited about being involved with. One of them is a little group called Piecing It Together. And this really was born out of the youth climate strikes. So there were these really large demonstrations in Winnipeg around climate action that were led by young people prior to the pandemic shutting a lot of activism down, a lot of sort of public activism down. And one of the things that seemed pretty apparent was that the youth were leading this, which was great. They were also looking for, like, where are the elders in this? And the elders were like, well, we don't want to come in and trample on what the youth are doing. I'm not sure how to get involved. How do I? And in particular, we were also seeing that not only with the youth climate strike, but with many social movements, what gets in the way of people being able to do the good work is the internal conflicts within the organizations themselves. And so we started piecing it together as a local group that brings together, we have all sorts of fantastic conflict resolution practitioners and facilitators here in Winnipeg, and so brings them together on a voluntary capacity with grassroots organizations that are needing just a little bit of help around facilitation or how to deal with the conflict that we have between these two members, or so that the conflict doesn't then bring down the social movements. So that's one thing that I'm excited about being involved with, working with lots of great people on this. Another thing that I'm really, really glad to be involved with is a group called Gesser, or Bridge, and it's a local group that brings together Jews and Palestinians and people that are concerned about the conflict in Israel and Palestine who are here in Winnipeg. And this is a difficult issue for people to talk about. And yet, if we can't talk about it in a place like Winnipeg, where can we talk about it, right? So trying to bring people together and bring them together, particularly through story. So we had an event on Friday night, Unbounded Stories, where we brought together storytellers that included storytellers from a variety of backgrounds and included Indigenous storytellers as well. So that's another group that I'm excited that I'm involved with. And then I'm always just excited to be involved with students. Folks in my classes are inspirational, and I feel incredibly grateful that the working part of my life gets to be a part of my life which is just as inspiring as anything I might do outside my work hours. It's hard for me to tell when I'm not working and when I'm working, because that's kind of seamless, and I really love that about the life that I'm getting to craft.
Sounds great. And just for my personal interest, because I've been several times to Israel-Palestine and lived there for a while. Have you been there, or have you been engaged in national activism?
Yeah, so one of the things that I will acknowledge I sidestepped for years in the classroom was the topic of Israel and Palestine. So just to give you a bit of my context, I teach at a nominally Christian college at a secular university, and there are Jewish students in my class every year, and they're often engaged and intelligent and bright, and they're a minority on the campus, and so I'm conscious of wanting to protect any kind of minority group or voice, and anti-Semitism is rife in Winnipeg, as it is, I'm sure, in many places. So there's that context, and then of course there are Palestinians and people who are Muslim with very strong feelings about the situation in Palestine, and so I just felt I didn't have the capacity in the classroom to be able to manage that, and so I would do the cowardly teacher sidestep whenever the topic would come up. You could do that's a really interesting point, we don't have enough time to explore it today, maybe another day, steer away. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Am I going to steer away from this important topic for the entirety of my teaching career? So 5 years ago, I went on a compassionate listening delegation to Israel and Palestine. Not sure if you know compassionate listening, but founded by Leah Green and others, wanting to find ways to open dialogue on difficult issues. And of course, Israel and Palestine is certainly one of those issues that people have very strong and polarizing views. So I feel really grateful that I was able to be on a compassionate listening delegation. I stayed a little bit before and a little bit after, so I could do a little bit of exploring on my own. By no means do I feel like I have expertise. What I can do is create and hold space for people who know more than I do and who have more skin in the game than I do to be able to have the difficult conversations. And so that's really been my role here in Winnipeg, is to try to be a person that can open space for others to have those tough conversations. And sometimes, Nina, that's a really uncomfortable place for me to be in. I would much rather, honestly, be able to like land two-footed in a particular activist stance. That's significantly easier for me than to be trying to walk this line of this isn't my best role here. My best role here is to help others be able to talk across difference. I find it very uncomfortable and very challenging, and also at the moment continues to feel like the sort of the most productive role that I can play, so that I can facilitate in different communities, so I can help different communities be able to listen to each other.
Yeah, I think no, to me that makes a lot of sense, because there is many topics that we cannot so easily take a stance on unless we have a direct experience and knowledge. So, and it's really an important part of conflict resolution to listen to each other. So.
Yeah, and I think as someone who comes from a European colonizing background, it's so easy for me to feel like I need to be like the voice, or I need to be, I need to say things. And so for me to step back and say, no, I actually don't need to say stuff here. What I need to do is help others be able to say what they need to say. That is, it makes me feel like I'm not doing anything, right? Because that's my definition of what's important to be a human, is to do things, right? And to be the one doing things. And that's such a colonizing perspective, right? That's such an unhelpful perspective, but it's pretty deep in me. So to make myself stand back and keep saying to myself, Karen, your best role here, your most helpful role here, is not to be an outspoken advocate on this topic, but is to keep opening space. Oh my goodness, Nina, that's tough. That's tough work. Yeah.
Yeah, I imagine also maybe sometimes you do have a strong opinion about something, and
I don't necessarily say it. Yeah, because it's not the most helpful thing. It might make me feel good, but it's not necessarily the most helpful thing.
Yeah. So I think I have one last question.
Okay.
Check. Yeah. This is just, what is your hope for the future?
That's a tough question. Because I also carry eco-grief, right? And despair. And sometimes when I step back and I look at things objectively, I feel pretty hopeless, because it seems to me that we are on a catastrophic course and we're not quickly enough getting ourselves off that course. And then I feel incredible sadness for people younger than me, for the children being born, for people in more marginalized communities around the world that are going to be the ones most affected, right? We know that Global North is creating most of the problems. Global South is experiencing most of the hardship, and will. So sometimes I feel sometimes it's hard for me to look at that, because I get overwhelmed by it. The things that I think bring me hope, one is just kind of focusing on what is it that I can do, and keeping my mind like, what is it? What's the job in front of me today? How do I do that the best I can? Certainly the people around me, again, students, colleagues, friends, people around the world like yourself, like people who inspire me. That's knowing that I'm not doing this by myself. That brings hope. A very profound source of my hope is that the current way we live in the world is untenable, right? Capitalism, the idea of we need to keep consuming more and more, make more profit. I mean, that's untenable on a finite planet. It's also not a healthy way to be in the world. And so these two things are going to crash, right? We can't continue with this type of lifestyle. And it's not a healthy lifestyle, right? It's a good lifestyle to get rid of. And so for me, there is hopefulness that things will have to radically change. And although there will be hardship in that radical change, there will also be an opening for a much better way of living in the world and with each other, because that's what will have to happen for this to be a sustainable world. And then the last thing, if you can bear one more short story. When I was a teenager, my dad was a university professor, and he ended up accidentally at a talk that was being given by a Salvadoran leader. And this leader had been someone who had been part of a reformist junta, and they'd done land reform, and he had been then overthrown by military coup, and had been incarcerated and tortured and fled El Salvador, and now was speaking in Canada at a very intense time in Salvador's history. Lots of media about Oscar Romero and the Catholic church workers, etc. So he was speaking in Winnipeg. My dad ended up by accident at this talk, and there were only 3 people there. There was the speaker, the translator, and my dad. And I often feel like that speaker must have left that talk feeling incredible despair and hopelessness, because in a city of almost 1 million people, one person really, because the translator doesn't count, one person had cared enough to come out. But that one person was so moved by the stories that he had heard, by the power of stories, and these stories in particular, that my dad had never heard of this stuff. He started to do research. He ended up in El Salvador. When he came back, he was involved in Salvadoran activism and support. Salvadorans would come through our home. I would meet Salvadorans. I got inspired by Salvadoran stories. I ended up these Chilean coffee houses. I ended up going and working for peace brigades in Guatemala and El Salvador. I ended up being arrested in El Salvador, and lots of media attention in Canada around that. Came back to Canada. I went on a speaking tour for a year, 7 talks a day, 7 days a week, thousands of people continued in this work. So that Salvadoran man has actually touched thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I want to find him and tell him, you know, that talk that you probably thought was absolutely hopeless? It was incredibly powerful. It made a huge difference in the world. You made a huge difference in the world. And sometimes I'm really glad, Nina, that I have no way of knowing who he was. Because then I think every time I do something, I have no idea what these ripples are. And these ripples could be just as vast as that one talk that he gave that he thought was hopeless. That was incredibly powerful. And so I just hope that each of my small actions can have some of those ripples as well. And I know that yours do, and my students and all of us having these small actions with these really powerful ripples. And so I really hang on to that as kind of a metaphor that keeps me going when I feel like, oh, you know, does this small action, getting compost at my apartment building, does that make a difference? Well, maybe it really does, and I just don't know. One last thing, there's a great Dorothy Day quote that, we're here to sow the seeds, and maybe we're a little arrogant to think we get to reap the harvest. And I think I try to live by that. I'm here to sow the seeds and just be hopeful that the harvest blossoms well.
Great. That was a nice story, actually, that we can all keep in mind. With all the small actions we do, we never know what will happen.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. So I think our time to finish has come. Thank you so much for all the stories. I really enjoyed them. And maybe actually I would like to know more about what you are doing and keep maybe informed so we can continue the conversation in that way.
Yeah, I'd love that, Nina. It's been really great being here with you. Again, thanks for your patience. We thought about doing this last week. Thanks for your patience and waiting for this week. But it's been really great talking with you, and I'd love to be in touch. So thank you so much. And thanks for all the work that you're doing. And I'm going to have a lot of fun looking at your website. So.
Yeah, I hope so. Great. Thank you, Karen. Take care.
Take care. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.